Welcome to Philosophy 105 Introduction to Ethics. This week we will be covering a couple of areas in the textbook in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, thinking about values and learning moral lessons from story. I would like to begin by providing just a few definitions that will be good for us in terms of practically understanding the concepts we're going to be looking at and knowing how those should be applied in our lives. The first is values. Values are the things that guide our behavior. A value is something that we place a high premium on. Morals and morality deal then with what we believe is the right thing versus the wrong thing. Whereas values can be broader than that. They, of course, include what we think is the right thing and the wrong thing, but values could also be just things that we prefer. Therefore, when we talk about morality and what is right and wrong, it doesn't make a lot of sense. If you remember in the Foundations unit, I talked about this. It doesn't make a lot of sense to say that our morals are just what is right for us, because that becomes only our preference and what brings us a sense of satisfaction and pleasure. Morality, to have meaning, must be the right thing, not only for us, but for others as well. That we would say to someone, this is not something I just prefer, this is something I think is good for everyone to follow. And then ethics involves the idea of how we apply our morality in our practical daily life. It, of course, involves attitudes, it involves our words and our actions. So behavior is a big part of understanding the ethical approach to life. Of course, not everyone agrees concerning the moral thing or the ethical thing. And we shouldn't be surprised when we discuss these viewpoints with people that there will be a diversity of opinion. However, the diversity of opinion doesn't prove or establish that all opinions are equally valid and equally right. So it's important to use the tools I gave you in the Foundations unit to work your way through the claims people make about what's right versus what's wrong and how we should live, and determine what makes the most sense. In addition, we should always consider the opinions and the rights of others to share those opinions. And we should strive to keep our interactions civil, hopeful, and honest. And one of the ways I think to accomplish this is to not view other people in a negative way as though they're stupid or evil. There are three possible ways that people have for looking at themselves in terms of their essence, their nature, their identity. And I want to talk about those three briefly here because I think that gives us a framework to work from in understanding ourselves and other people. One of the ways is a concept I call imago naturalis. This is Latin for the image of nature. And there are people who believe that they, as human beings, and others as human beings, are solely the product of natural forces, and therefore everything about them is a result of the forces of nature, such as evolutionary forces in naturalistic evolution, and that explains everything about our physical makeup, about our thinking processes, about our morality and our behavior. That viewpoint, if one holds it for oneself, creates some problems concerning how do we make the connection between those tangible things of nature and the things that seem very real that are not tangible. Quick example of this would be the distinction between the brain as a physical organ and the mind and consciousness as non-physical reality. And there doesn't seem to be a really good way in the imago naturalis approach to demonstrate how those intangibles came into being as a result of purely naturalistic forces. There's also a further problem when you begin to examine the question of how did naturalistic reality occur in the first place? Where did it come from? So that viewpoint is problematic in some ways philosophically, and it also affects how we treat others if we view them solely as products of nature. To put it in a crude way, if all human beings is the result of physical natural forces, and that result is simply a collection of, you know, bone, flesh, blood, and so forth, and then how those physical elements interact together. So, what we call the intangibles, mind, consciousness, emotion, really are just the results of processes going on within us physically. If this is how we view ourselves, it is also how we view others. And that leads to some very interesting and I think problematic areas concerning the things we say and the things we do concerning others. Because if they are nothing but physical stuff, then the question of anything higher in terms of their being is eliminated. And of course, that changes a lot of things about how we view what can be done in our relationship with other people. The second approach is what I call imago impersonale. This approach opts for the idea that we exist, or human beings by essence and nature, are the product of an impersonal force which is not physical. It transcends the physical or empirical realm, and somehow it has resulted in human beings existing. Of course, impersonale means impersonal, which means no personhood, no personality. And the problem in this view is if that's how we view ourselves and others, the question is, how did that happen? How did we get personhood, personality, mind, consciousness, and so forth as human beings if there was no personality and personhood to draw from in the first place? Furthermore, the problem also exists how an impersonal force, for example, a force like gravity, which is not a person, doesn't have personhood, doesn't have personality, how a force like that could create or cause a personal being. And of course, if you adopt the view that it was an impersonal force that led to you, there are important moral, metaphysical, ontological, and teleological questions that are raised that are very difficult to answer. Questions like, who am I, what am I, and why am I here? And then how should I live in the moral, ethical realm? How should I treat others? Because you see, in imago impersonale, there's nothing personal there. So why would it be important to view others as valuable as persons with personality? The third viewpoint I call imago Dei. That's Latin for the image of God. And by God, I'm talking about a being that has personhood and personality, that is the superlative being, the highest being possible. And therefore, if human beings are created in the image of that being, then the question of where does personality and personhood come from is answered. And I might add that the Imago Dei view is the highest image for humans possible, because you can go no higher than the ultimate superlative being. It is the highest being possible. Any other imaging that we choose or adopt is always a downgrade. But also recognize from a moral, ethical standpoint, if a person views himself or herself as created in the image of God, it is necessary that they also view others as created in that same image. This implies a great deal concerning how we should value, demonstrate dignity and fairness and justice toward others, because after all, they are also bearers and carriers of the image of the superlative being and need to be respected and treated in that manner. So, having established these various views of ourselves, I would tell you that my preference and how I view myself and how I view you and other people is the Imago Dei model. I feel it affords the best approach to accomplishing positive things in my life and the lives of other people. But it's more than just a philosophical commitment I've made because of logic and reason and evidentiary support that shows it's beneficial. It's more than that because it gets to the deepest part or the core of my being in terms of my intrinsic worth and value, and then also what I believe is to be your intrinsic worth and value. I believe you are an amazing, remarkable being who deserves to be taken seriously and valued and treated with dignity and respect. Now, in your textbook, the author of your textbook, Professor Rosenstand, has an approach that's a little bit different. I think she truly values her humanity and the humanity of others. However, I feel like she limits somewhat the ability to reach the highest level for dealing with moral and ethical issues. And this is because she says that she prefers not to bring, in her view, quote, religion into the discussion because that's theological and should be carried out in some other place. The problem with that is every moral and ethical decision, in some respect, because of the transcendent metaphysical nature of the issue, becomes potentially a religious issue. Now, I'm not talking about a particular faith viewpoint like Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, so forth. I'm talking about an overarching view metaphysically that when we talk about morality and ethics, we're talking about human views and responses that transcend merely sociological, psychological, and physical context. So I think she limits herself somewhat. I don't know what the reason for that is. Perhaps it's because she doesn't have the understanding of what religion is as opposed to faith. Religion, by definition, is from the Latin religare, which means to put back into bondage. Re meaning to return again, ligare being the word we get ligament and ligature from, which are binding elements that hold things together, but also restrict and bind. So religion is always about putting people into some kind of bondage. And I find this very distasteful because I believe that bondage is the antithesis of freedom. Now, bondage and commitment are not the same thing. You can be committed, and in your commitment, follow through because you feel you have a sense of duty and you have a desire for the outcomes that result from your commitment. That's not bondage. Bondage is you put yourself into a situation where you are obligated and have to do things or else. Okay? So religion is really about making those kinds of rules and putting in a hierarchy of authority that controls how people live out those rules. Islam and the 5 pillars of Islam is an excellent example. There's no real freedom there. You have to adhere to those 5 pillars and do it dutifully and diligently or else. I would tell you that there is one viewpoint, faith viewpoint, in the world. It's the only one like it. It's the only one I've found that is not a religion, and that's Christianity. In fact, in the Bible, in the Gospels and the writings of the New Testament, the word religion is never used to describe Christianity. In fact, Jesus in his teachings talked much about how he came to set people free from bondage, and his major conflicts in his day seemed to be with the religious leaders of his time, the Pharisees, Sadducees, who were much about control and keeping people in the bondage to the law. The only place in the New Testament where the word religion even shows up is in the book of James, where James contrasts faith in Christ and being a follower of Jesus with religion. And he says that if you want to put it in terms of religion, the truest religion is to be free, to be like Christ, and to take care of people and treat them as he would, especially those who are the least fortunate or the most in need, those needing grace and mercy. So I think this idea of religion and faith as a talking point for moral ethical decisions is very important. And also it's important to maintain that distinction between faith and freedom and religion and bondage. Alongside values, morals, and ethics, we find the word ethos, the Greek word meaning character, but I like to explain it this way. Ethos is the essence of who you really are, those components that truly define who you are as a person and enable us to understand who we are, and for others to understand us, and for us to understand others. Now, this, of course, brings up the question of good versus evil. And what I've been talking about right here really comes to the forefront when you start talking about good and evil. To attempt to explain good and evil solely in terms of humanistic, social, and cultural context, or in terms of natural processes in the physical world, is limiting. Questions of the soul and the spirit are important. Questions of consciousness and the mind and the will really matter. Whether we're talking about natural disasters and human tragedies that occur from things like earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, or diseases, accidents, or whether we're talking about willful and purposeful acts that we consider evil and harmful that people do to themselves and others. The idea of a metaphysical explanation for those things is valid and it's important. And whether we talk about it in terms of religion or in terms of faith really doesn't matter. I prefer to talk about it in terms of transcendent metaphysics, which of course gets into the area of what might be out there in the metaphysical realm. For example, when your textbook talks about moral naturalism, it seems to indicate that moral naturalism answers the question of where morals come from by saying they're intrinsic to human beings. But the naturalism element fosters the impression that these things have arisen through naturalistic processes and forces. And this isn't necessarily the case. If you go back to my Imago Dei perspective, you could argue just as effectively, and perhaps more so, that the intrinsic values that people hold, or the intrinsic morality that you find in humanity, is a result of being created in the image of a moral being. So, of course, those things become intrinsic to the one who's created. Further example of what we're talking about here is the limitations from a naturalistic or humanistic perspective to explain why people do what they do. The experiments that are talked about in your book concerning human behavior by Milgram and Zimbardo effectively and dramatically show us what people do under certain conditions in certain contexts that we may find questionable and disturbing. But explaining what people do or showing us what people do doesn't necessarily explain why people are doing it. We may get some insights or some inferences into why they're doing it, things like peer pressure, of course, or willing to submit to an authority, which is what we see happening in those experiments. But the larger question of what is it about people in the first place that makes them willing to do such things becomes a spiritual, metaphysical kind of a question that needs to be examined. Otherwise, we may proceed forward in attempting to address those behaviors and come to a truly moral response without looking at perhaps the most important things of all. This matters because moral dilemmas are real. The trolley car example in your textbook reveals this clearly. If you are faced with a choice where neither one of your options is ideal, but you must choose one, this is truly a moral dilemma, especially when it will affect the lives of other people in dramatic fashion. My opinion is to attempt to resolve those kinds of difficult situations without including a metaphysical transcendent possibility for dealing with it limits our options and may, in fact, prevent us from arriving at the place where we can make the very best of the very worst of situations. So, as we proceed in this course, I will be pointing some of those issues out, and I will be also attempting to help you think through those difficult situations to come to some conclusions for yourself about what the moral and ethical thing really is. We're going to stop this lecture here, and next time we'll pick up and talk a little bit more about various approaches to morality and ethics. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful day and stay involved in the work you need to do for the class. Thank you.